Hello, everyone. So glad we can be together again for another little episode of The Silver Chair. What an exciting story this has been. Wow. Last time we saw how Prince Rilian had gotten the children had let him go from being tied to that awful silver chair, and he had hacked it to pieces with his sword. And then when the queen came in, she turned into a serpent, and Rilian was able to, with the help of Eustace, was able to hack off her head. And now they're free. And Rilian is completely in his right mind. And now they've got to figure out how to get him back to Narnia and hopefully get there in time to see his dad. We'll find out some more about that as we go on. Today's chapter, number 13, is called Underland Without the Queen. So let's dive right in. All felt that they had earned what Scrub called a breather. The witch had locked the door and told the Earthmen not to disturb her, so there was no danger of interruption for the present. Their first business was, of course, Puddleglum's burnt foot. A couple of clean shirts from the prince's bedroom, torn into strips and well greased on the inside with butter and salad oil from the table, made fairly good dressing. And when this had been applied, they all sat down and had a little refreshment and discussed plans on how to escape from the underworld. Rilian explained that there were a lot of outlets, actually, by which one could get to the surface. He had been taken out through most of them at one time or another, but he had never gone alone, only with the witch. And he had always reached these outlets by going in a ship across the sunless sea first. What the Earthmen would say if they went down to the harbor without the witch and with 3 strangers and simply ordered a ship, no one could guess. Most likely they would ask awkward questions. On the other hand, the new outlet, the one for the invasion of the overworld, was on this side of the sea and only a few miles away. The prince knew that it was nearly finished. Only a few feet of earth divided the diggings from the outer air. It was even possible that it was now quite finished. Perhaps the witch had come back to tell him this and to prepare for the attack. Even if it was not, they could probably dig themselves out by that route in just a few hours. If only they could get there without being stopped, and if only they found the diggings unguarded, but those were the difficulties. "If you ask me," began Puddleglum, but when Scrub interrupted him, "I say," he said, "what is that noise?" "I've been wondering that for some time," said Jill. They had, in fact, all been hearing the noise, but it had begun so gradually and increased so slowly that they didn't know when they first noticed it. For a time, it had only been vague disquiet like gentle winds or traffic far away. But then it swelled into a murmur like the sea. Then came rumblings and rushings, and now there seemed to be voices as well, and also a steady roaring that wasn't voices. "By the lion," said Prince Rilian, "it seems that this silent land has found its tongue at last." He rose and walked to the window and drew aside the curtains, and the others crowded around him to look. The very first thing they noticed was a deep, bright red glow. Its reflection made a red patch on the roof of the underworld thousands of feet above them, so that they could see a rocky ceiling which perhaps had been hidden in darkness ever since that world was made. The glow itself came from the far side of the city, so that many buildings, grim and great, stood up blackly before it. But it also cast its light down many streets that ran from it toward the castle. And in those streets, something very strange was going on. The closely packed, silent crowds of Earthmen had vanished. Instead, there were figures darting about, by ones or twos or threes. They behaved like people who did not want to be seen. They were lurking in shadows behind walls or in doorways and then moving quickly across the open spaces to fresh places of hiding. But the strangest of all, to anyone who knew the gnomes, was the noise. Shouts and cries came from all directions. But from the harbor there came a low, rumbling roar, which grew steadily louder and was already shaking the whole city. What's happened to the Earthmen? Said Scrub. Is it them shouting? It's hardly possible, said the prince. I never heard one of the rascals so much as speak with a loud voice in all the weary years of my bondage. This is some new devilry, I've no doubt. And what is that red light over there? Asked Jill. Is something on fire? If you ask me, said Puddleglum, I would say that it's the central fires of the earth breaking out to make a new volcano. We'll be in the middle of it, I shouldn't wonder. Look at that ship, said Scrub. It's coming so quickly and no one is rowing it. Oh, look, said the prince, the ship is already far on this side of the harbor. It's actually in the street. Look, all the ships are driving into the city. The sea is rising. The flood is upon us. Aslan be praised. This castle stands on high ground, but the water is coming on grimly fast. Oh, what can be happening? Cried Jill. Fire and water and all these people dodging about in the streets? I'll tell you what it is, said Puddleglum. That witch has laid a train of magic spells so that whenever she was killed, at the same moment her whole kingdom would fall to pieces. She's the sort that wouldn't mind dying herself if she knew that the one who killed her was going to be burned or buried or drowned 5 minutes later. You have hit on it, friend Wiggle, said the prince. When our swords hacked off the witch's head, that stroke ended her magic works, and now the deep lands are falling to pieces. We are looking at the end of the underworld. That's it, sir, said Puddleglum, unless it should happen that it's the end of the whole world. But are we just going to stand here and wait? Gasped Jill. Not by my counsel, said the prince. I would say, get my horse Coalblack and the witch's Snowflake, who is a worthy beast and worthy of a better mistress than this. They are both stabled in the courtyard. And after that, let us hurry to get to high ground and pray that we'll find an outlet. The horses can carry 2 each, and if we put them to it, they may run faster than the flood is advancing. Will your highness not put on your armor? Asked Puddleglum. I don't like the look of those. And he pointed down the street. And everyone looked down. Dozens of creatures, and now that they were close, they were obviously Earthmen. They were coming up from the direction of the harbor. But they were not moving like an aimless crowd. They behaved like modern soldiers in an attack, making rushes and taking cover, anxious not to be seen from the castle windows. I don't want to see the inside of that armor again, said the prince. I rode in it as a movable dungeon, and it stinks of magic and slavery, but I will take my shield. He left the room and returned with a strange light in his eyes a moment later. Look, friends, he said, holding out the shield. An hour ago it was black without any device on it, and now this. The shield had turned bright as silver, and on it, redder than blood or cherries, was the figure of the lion. Doubtless, said the prince, this signifies that Aslan will be our good lord, whether he means us to live or to die, and it's all the same for all that. Now, by my counsel, we shall all kneel and kiss his likeness, and then we shall all shake hands with one another, as true friends that may shortly be parted. And then let us descend into the city and take the adventure that comes to us. And they all did, as the prince had said. But when Scrub shook hands with Jill, he said, So long, Jill. I'm sorry I've been a funk and so ratty. I hope you'll get safely home. And Jill said, So long, Eustace, and I'm sorry I've been such a pig. And this was the first time they had ever used their first names, because no one did it at Experiment House. The prince unlocked the door, and they all went down the stairs. 3 of them with drawn swords, and Jill with her drawn knife. The attendants had all vanished, and the great room at the foot of the prince's stairs was empty. The gray, doleful lamps were still burning, and by their light they had no difficulty in passing from gallery to gallery and descending stairway after stairway. The noises from outside the castle were not so easily heard here as they had been in the room above. Inside the house, all was still as death and deserted. It was as they turned a corner into the great hall on the ground that they met their first Earthman. a fat whitish creature with a very pig-like face, who was gobbling up all the remains of the food on the table. It squealed, the squeal of which sounded very much like a pig, and darted under a bench, whisking its long tail out of Puddleglum's reach just in the nick of time. Then it rushed away through the far door, too quickly to be followed. From the hall, they came out into the courtyard. Jill, who went to a riding school in the holidays, had just noticed the smell of a stable. A very nice, honest, homely smell it is to meet in a place like the Underland. And Eustace said, "Great Scott, look at that!" A magnificent rocket had risen from somewhere beyond the castle walls and broken into green stars. "Fireworks?" said Jill in a puzzled voice. "Yes, but you can't imagine that these Earthmen are letting them off for fun. It must be a signal." "And it means no good to us, I'll be bound," said Puddleglum. "Friends," said the prince, "when once a man is launched on such an adventure as this, he must bid farewell to all his hopes and fears. Otherwise, death or deliverance will both come too late to save his honor and his reason. So ho, my beauties!" He was now opening the stable door. "Hey, steady, Coal-Black! Softly now, Snowflake! You are not forgotten." The horses had been frightened by the strange noises, and Jill, who had been so cowardly about going through into a black hole between one cave and another, went without fear in between the stamping and the snorting beasts, and she and the prince saddled the horses in a very few minutes. Very fine they looked as they came out into the courtyard, tossing their heads. Jill mounted Snowflake, and Puddleglum got up behind her. Eustace got up behind the prince on Coal-Black. Then, with a great echo of hoofs, they rode out of the main gateway and into the street. "Not much danger of being burned, that's the bright side of it," observed Puddleglum, pointing to their right. And there, hardly 100 yards away, lapping against the wall of the houses, was water. "Courage," said the prince. "The road there goes down steeply. That water has climbed only halfway up the highest hill in the city. It might come so near in the first half hour and come no nearer in the next two. My fear is more of that." And he pointed with his sword at a great, tall earthman with boar's tusks, followed by 6 others of assorted shapes and sizes, who had just dashed out of a side street and stepped into the shadow of the houses where no one could see them. The prince led them, always aiming in the direction of the glowing red lights, but a little to the left of it. His plan was to get around the fire, if it was a fire, onto higher ground, in the hopes that they might make their way to the new diggings. Here they are on their horses. There's Jill and Puddleglum on Snowflake, and behind them is William and Eustace. We can't really see them too well on Coal-Black. And all the little lights in the distance there, and you can see the little Earthmen are running for cover. Unlike the other 3, he almost seemed to be enjoying himself. He whistled as he rode along and sang verses about an old song about Corin Thunderfist of Archenland. The truth was, he was so glad at being free from his long enchantment that all dangers seemed to be a game in comparison, but the rest of them found it rather an eerie journey. Behind them was the sound of clashing and entangling ships and the rumble of collapsing buildings. Overhead was the great patch of lurid light on the roof of the underworld. Ahead was the mysterious glow, which did not seem to grow any bigger. From the same direction came the continual hubbub of shouts and screams and laughter and squeals and bellowings, and fireworks of all sorts rose in the dark air. No one could guess what they meant. Nearer to them, the part of the city that was lit up by the red glow, and partly by the very different light of the gnomes' dreary lamps. There were many places, though, where neither of these lights fell, and those places were jet black. And in and out of those places, the shape of Earthmen was darting and slipping all the time, always with their eyes fixed on the travelers, always trying to keep out of sight themselves. There were little and big faces, huge eyes like fishes' eyes, little eyes like bears'. There were feathers and bristles and horns and tusks and chins so long that they looked like beards. And every now and then, a group of them would get too big or come too near, and then the prince would brandish his sword and make a show of charging them. And the creatures, with all manner of hootings and squeakings and cluckings, would dive away into the darkness. But when they had climbed many steep streets and were far away from the flood, and almost out of town on the inland side, it began to get more serious. They were now close to the red glow, and nearly on a level with it. They still couldn't tell what it was. By its light, they could see their enemies more clearly. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of gnomes were all moving toward it. But they were doing so in short rushes, and whenever they stopped, they turned and faced the travelers. "If your highness asks me," said Puddleglum, "I'd say those fellows are meaning to cut us off in front." "That was my thought too, Puddleglum," said the prince, "and we can never fight our way through so many. Hark you, let us ride forth as close by the edge of yonder house there, and even as we reach it, you slip off into the shadows. The lady and I will go forward a few paces, and some of those devils will follow us, no doubt. They are thick behind us, but you, who have long arms, take one alive if you can, and as you lay ambush, and we may get a true tale out of it, or learn what is their quarrel against us." "But won't all the others come rushing at us to rescue the one we catch?" said Jill, in a voice not quite so steady as she was trying to make it. "Then, madam," said the prince, "you will see us die fighting around you, and you must commend yourself to the lion. Now, good Puddleglum." And the Marshwiggle slipped off into the shadows as quickly as a cat. The others, for a sickening minute or two, went forward at a walk. And then suddenly from behind them there broke out a series of blood-curdling screams, mixed with the familiar voice of Puddleglum saying, "Now then, don't cry before you're even hurt, or you will be hurt, see? Anyone would think you were a pig being killed." "That was good hunting," exclaimed the prince, immediately turning coal-black and coming back to the corner of the house. "Eustace," he said, "take coal-black's head, please." And then he dismounted. All three gazed in silence while Puddleglum pulled his catch out into the light. It was a most miserable little gnome, only about 3 feet tall. It had a sort of ridge, like a rooster's comb, only hard on the top of its head, little pink eyes, and a mouth and chin so round that his face looked like a little hippopotamus. If they had not been in such a tight place, they would have burst out laughing at the sight of it. "Now, Earthman," said the prince, standing over it and holding his sword point very near the prisoner's neck, "speak up like an honest gnome, and you shall go free. But if you try to trick us, you are but a dead Earthman. Puddleglum, how can it speak while you're holding his mouth tight shut?" "I am, but so he won't bite," said Puddleglum. "If I had the silly soft hands you human have, your highness's reverence, I'd have been all over blood. I'd have had blood all over me by now. Yet even a Marshwiggle gets tired of being chewed." "Sir," said the prince to the gnome, "one bite and you die." "Let his mouth open, Puddleglum." "Ooh!" squealed the Earthman. "Let me go, it isn't me, I didn't do it." "Didn't do what?" said Puddleglum. "Whatever you say I did do," answered the creature. "Tell me your name," said the prince, "and what you Earthmen are all about today." "Oh, please, your honor, please, kind gentleman, promise you won't tell the queen anything I say." "The queen, as you call her," the prince said sternly, "is dead. I killed her myself." "What?" cried the gnome, opening its ridiculous mouth wider and wider in astonishment. "Dead? The witch is dead? And by your honor's hand?" It gave a great, huge sigh of relief and added, "Why, then, your honor is a friend." The prince withdrew his sword an inch or two, and Puddleglum let the creature sit up. It looked around on the four travelers with its twinkling red eyes, chuckled once or twice, and began. Don't you want to hear his story? I do too. Let's read chapter 14. The Bottom of the World. "My name is Golg," said the gnome, and I will tell your honors all I know. About an hour ago, we were all going about our work, her work, I should say, sad and silent as we've done any other day for years and years. And then came a great crash and a bang. And as soon as they heard it, everybody said to himself, I haven't had a song or a dance for a long time. What is that? And everybody thinks to himself, I've been enchanted. And then everybody says to himself, I'm blessed if I know why I'm carrying this load. I'm not going to carry it any further. That's that. And we all threw down our sacks and our bundles and our tools. And then everyone turns and we see the great red glow over yonder. And everyone says to himself, What's that? And everyone answers himself and said, There's a crack or a chasm split open and a nice warm glow coming up from the really deep land, 1,000 fathoms below us. Great Scott, said Eustace. Are there other lands still lower down? Oh, yes, your honor, said Gulg. Lovely places. What we call the land of Bism. This country where we are now, the witches' country, is what we call the shallow lands. It's a good deal too near the surface to suit us. Ugh, you might as well be living on the outside, on the surface. You see, we're all poor gnomes from Bism, from which the witch has called us up here by her magic to work for her. But we'd forgotten all about it until that crash came and the spell broke. We didn't know who we were or where we belonged. We couldn't do anything or think anything except what she put into our heads, and it was gloomy things she put in there all these years. I've nearly forgotten how to make a joke or how to dance a jig. But the moment that bang came and the chasm opened and the sea began rising, it all came back. And of course, we all set off as quick as we could to get down the crack and home to our own place. And you can see them over there, all letting off rockets and standing on their heads for joy. And I'd be very obliged to your honors if you'd let me go and join in. I think this is simply splendid, said Jill. I'm very glad we freed the gnomes as well as ourselves when we cut off the witch's head, and I'm so glad they aren't really horrid and gloomy any more than the prince really was. Well, that's all very well, Pole, said Puddleglum cautiously, but these gnomes don't look to me like chaps who were just running away. They look to me like a military foundation. You look me in the face, Mr. Gulg, and tell me, were you preparing for battle? Of course we were, your honor, said Gulg. You see, we didn't know the witch was dead. We thought she was watching us from the castle. We were trying to slip away without being seen. And when you four came out with swords and horses, well, of course, everyone says to himself, Here it comes, not knowing that his honor wasn't on the witch's side. And we were determined to fight like anything, rather than give up the hope of going back to Bism. I swear this is an honest gnome, said the prince. Let go of it, friend Puddleglum. And as for me, good Gulg, I have been enchanted like you and your fellows, but have newly remembered myself. And now, one question more. Do you know the way to those new diggings by which the sorceress meant to lead out an army against the overland? Eee! Squeaked Gulg. Yes, I know that terrible road. I will show you where it begins, but it's no use your honor asking me to go with you. I would rather die. Why? Said Eustace anxiously. What's so dreadful about it? It's too near the top, too near the outside, said Gulg, shuddering. That was the worst thing the witch did to us. We were going to be led out into the open, into the outside of the world. They say there's no roof at all there, only great horrible emptinesses. They call it the sky. And the diggings have gone so far that a few strokes of the pick would bring you out into it. I wouldn't dare go near them. Now you're talking, cried Eustace. And Jill said, But it's not all horrible up there, Gulg. We like it. We live there. I know you overlanders live there, said Gulg, but I thought it was because you couldn't find your way down inside. Surely you can't really like it, crawling about like flies on top of the world. What about showing us the road, said Puddleglum. That's right, said the prince, and the whole party set out. The prince remounted his charger, Puddleglum climbed up behind Jill, and Gog led the way. And as he went, he kept shouting out the good news that the witch was dead and that the four overlanders were not dangerous. And those who heard him shouted it to others, so that in a few minutes the whole of the Underland was ringing with shouts and cheers, and gnomes by hundreds and thousands were leaping, turning cartwheels, standing on their heads, playing leapfrog, and letting off huge fireworks and crackers. And they came pressing around Coldlack and Snowflake. Here are the underworld people doing their dancing and cheering and letting off fireworks and whatnot. And then the prince had to tell the story of his own enchantments and his deliverance at least 10 times. In this way, they came to the edge of the chasm. It was about 1,000 feet long and perhaps 200 feet wide. They dismounted from their horses and came to the edge and looked down into it. A strong heat smote up into their faces, mixed with a smell which was quite unlike anything they'd ever smelled before. It was rich and sharp and exciting, and it made you sneeze. The depth of the chasm was so bright that at first it dazzled their eyes and they could see nothing. When they got used to it, they thought they could make out a river of fire, and on the banks of that river what seemed to be fields and groves of an unbearable hot brilliance, though they were dim compared with the river. There were blues, reds, greens, and whites all jumbled together. A very good stained glass window with a bright sun staring straight through it at midday might have had something of the same effect. Down the rugged sides of the chasm, looking like black flies against all that fiery light, hundreds of earthmen were climbing down as quickly as they could. "Your honors," said Gulg, and when they turned around to look at him, they could see nothing but blackness for a few minutes because their eyes were so dazzled. "Your honors, why don't you come down to Bism? You'd be happier there than in your world. Your world is naked and unprotected on top. At least do come down for a short visit." Jill took it for granted that none of the others would listen to such an idea for a moment, but to her horror, she heard the prince saying, "Truly, friend Gog, I have half a mind to come down with you, for this is a marvelous adventure, and it may be that no mortal man has ever looked into Bism before, or will ever have the chance again. And I don't know whether, as the years pass, I could bear to remember that it was once in my power to have probed the uttermost pit of the earth, and that I refused to do it. But could a man live down there? You don't swim in that fire river yourselves, do you?" "Oh, no, your honor, not we. It's only the salamanders who live in the fire themselves." "And what kind of beast is your salamander?" asked the prince. "Well, it's hard to tell, your honor, for they're too white-hot to look at, but they're sort of like small dragons, and they speak to us out of the fire. They're most wonderfully clever with their tongues, very witty and eloquent." Jill glanced hastily at Eustace. She felt sure that he would like the idea of sliding down that chasm even less than she did, but her heart sank as she saw that his face was quite changed. He looked more like the prince than like the old scrub at Experiment House, for all his adventures and the days when he had sailed with King Caspian were coming back to him. "Your Highness," he said, "if my old friend Reepicheep the Mouse were here, he would say we could not refuse the adventures of Bism without a great impeachment to our honor." "Down there," said Gulg, "I could show you real gold, real silver, and real diamonds." "Oh, bosh," said Jill rudely, "as if we didn't know that we're below the deepest mines right here." "Yes," said Gulg, "I have heard of those little scratches in the crust that you call mines, but that's where you get dead gold, dead silver, dead gems. But down here in Bism, we have them alive and growing. There, I'll pick you bunches of rubies that you could eat and squeeze you a cup of diamond juice if you like. You won't care much about fingering the cold, dead treasures of your shallow mines once you have tasted the live ones of Bism." "My father went to the world's end," said Rillian thoughtfully. "It really would be a marvelous thing if his son went to the bottom of our world." If your highness wants to see your father while he's still alive, then, which I think he would prefer, then I think it's time we get onto that road up to the diggings. I won't go down that hole no matter what anybody else says, said Jill. Well, if your honors are really set to go back to the overworld, said Golg, there is one bit of road that's a little lower than this, and perhaps if that flood is still rising. Oh, come on, let's go, begged Jill. I fear that it must be so, said the prince with a deep sigh, but I have left half my heart in the land of Bism. Please, begged Jill. Where's the road? Said Puddleglum. There are lamps all along the way, said Golg. Your honor can see the beginning of the road on the far side of the chasm. How long will the lamps burn for? Asked Puddleglum. At that moment, a hissing, scorching voice like the voice of fire itself, they wondered afterwards if it could have been a salamander's, came whistling out of the very depths of Bism. Quick, to the cliffs, it said. The rift is closing. It closes. Quick. And at the same time, with ear-shattering cracks and creaks, the rocks moved. Already, while they looked, the chasm was narrower. From every side, belated gnomes were rushing into it. They didn't wait to climb down. They flung themselves down headlong. And either because the blast was so strong, that hot air that was beating up from the bottom, or for some other reason, they could be seen floating downward like leaves. And their blackness almost blotted out the fiery river and the groves of live gems. Goodbye to your honors, I'm off, shouted Golg, and he dived. Only a few were left now to follow him. The chasm was now no broader than a stream. Now it was only an intense bright thread. And then with a shock, like 1,000 goods trains crashing into 1,000 more goods trains, the lips of the rocks closed. The hot, maddening smell vanished. The travelers were alone in an underworld which now looked far blacker than before. Pale, dim, and dreary lamps marked the direction of the road. Now, said Puddleglum, it's 10 to 1. We've already stayed too long, but we may as well make a try. Those lamps will give out in 5 minutes, I shouldn't wonder. They urged the horses to a canter and thundered along the dusty road in fine style. But almost at once it began going downhill. They would have thought that Golg had sent them the wrong way if they had not seen on the other side of the valley that the lamps were going upward as far as the eye could reach. But at the bottom of the valley, the lamps shone on moving water. Hurry, cried the prince, and they galloped down the slope. It would have been nasty enough at the bottom even 5 minutes later, for the tide was running up that valley, and if it had come to swimming, the horses could hardly have won. But when they got there, it was still only a foot or two deep, and though it swished terribly around the horses' legs, they did reach the other side in safety. Then began the slow, weary march uphill, with nothing ahead to look at but the pale lamps which went up and up and up as far as the eye could see. And when they looked back, they could see the water spreading. All the hills of the underland were now islands, and it was only on those islands that the lamps remained. Every moment some distant light vanished. Soon there would be total darkness, except on the road that they were following, and even on the lower part of it behind them. Though no lamps had gone out yet, the lamplight was shining on water. Here they are as they go on the water, and you can see the road stretching out ahead of them there. Although they had good reason for hurrying, the horses could not go on forever without a rest. They halted, and in silence they could hear the lapping of the water behind them. I wonder, Father Time flooded out now, said Jill, and all those queer sleeping animals. I don't think we're quite as high as that, said Eustace. Don't you remember how we had to go downhill to reach the sunless sea? I shouldn't think that the water has reached Father Time yet. That's as may be, said Puddleglum. I'm more interested in the lamps on this road. Look a bit sickly, don't they? They always did, said Jill. But they're greener now. You don't mean to think they're going out, do you? Well, however they work, you can't expect them to last forever, you know, replied the Marsh Wiggle. But don't let your spirits down, Scrub. I've got my eye on the water too, and I don't think it's rising quite as fast as it did. Small comfort, friend, said the prince. If we can't find our way out, I'm to blame for my pride and fantasy which delayed us by the mouth of the land of Bism. But let's ride on now. During the hour or two that followed, Jill sometimes thought that Puddleglum was right about the lamps, and sometimes she thought it was only her imagination. But meanwhile, the land was changing. The roof of the Underland was so near that even by that dull light they could see it quite distinctly. And the great rugged walls of the Underland could be seen drawing closer on each side. The road was, in fact, leading them up into a steep tunnel. They began to pass picks and shovels and barrows and other signs that the diggers had recently been at work. If only one could be sure of getting out, this was very cheering. But the thoughts of going on into a hole that would get narrower and narrower and harder to turn back in was very unpleasant. At last, the roof was so low that Puddleglum and the prince knocked their heads against it. So they all dismounted and led the horses. The road was uneven here, and one had to pick one's steps with some care. And that was how Jill noticed the growing darkness. There was no doubt about it now. The faces of the others looked strange and ghastly in that green glow. And then, all at once, she couldn't help it, Jill gave a little scream. One night light, the next one ahead, went out altogether. The one behind them did the same. They were in absolute darkness. Courage, friends, came Prince Rillian's voice. Whether we live or die, Aslan will be our good lord. That's right, sir, said Puddleglum's voice. And you must always remember there's one good thing about being trapped down here. You'll save funeral expenses. Jill held her tongue. If you don't want other people to know how frightened you are, this is always a wise thing to do, because it's your voice that gives you away. We might as well go on and stand here, said Eustace, and when she heard the tremble in his voice, Jill knew that she was wise not to trust her own. Puddleglum and Eustace went first, with their arms stretched out in front of them for fear of blundering into anything. Jill and the prince followed, leading the horses. I say, came Eustace's voice, much later, are my eyes going queer, or is there a patch of light up there? But before anyone could answer him, Puddleglum called out, Stop! I'm up against a dead end, and it's earth, not rock. What were you saying, Scrub? By the lion, said the prince, Eustace is right. There's a sort of... But it's not daylight, said Jill. It's only a cold blue sort of light. It's better than nothing, said Eustace. Can we get up to it? Well, it's not right overhead, said Puddleglum. It's above us, but it's in this wall that I've run into it. How would it be, Pole, if you got up on my shoulders and saw whether you could get up to it? And that is the end of chapter 14. And the next chapter is called The Disappearance of Jill. We've got to come back for that one, don't we? This is an exciting story. I'm loving it. I hope you are too. And you know what? The next two chapters are the last two chapters of the book. I'm going to be very sorry when this story is over. I really will be. Anyway, we're not through yet. We'll read another story tomorrow. Meanwhile, I hope you have enjoyed it so far, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.